Yeah, I mean, David, at the top level, they give out 11,000 grants, like you said, nearly $5 billion each year, roughly going to nonprofits and local and state governments. When you dig into the data, it's interesting. You see that about 7% of the recipients are unknown. So if you dig into the federal data, we don't actually have the data to know where 7% of these grants are going, or either it's not being reported, one of the two. But when you dig beyond those 7%, you start seeing kind of what you would expect. So you have states like California, Texas, Florida, and New Jersey are some of the biggest recipients. Cities like Chicago and Milwaukee are large recipients. And then you see an interesting mix of nonprofits, everything from ones folks know, like the Boys and Girls Club of America, to more obscure ones like the Institute for Intergovernmental Research.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Hey everyone, welcome to the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fromm. Government spending affects all Americans because the more they spend, the more they take out of your wallet to pay for it. That's why we have a series called Big Ideas for Smaller Government. The goal of the series is to highlight how $2 trillion could be cut from the federal budget. And we may be able to reach that goal in this episode. Today, we're going to talk about the Department of Justice, or DOJ. The first Attorney General, Edmund Jennings Randolph, was appointed in 1789, and it was a part-time role. The DOJ wasn't established until 1870, and it was created to serve the federal government's chief law enforcement agency. Before that, legal issues were handled by various departments, but as the country grew, so did its need for a dedicated department to handle everything from federal prosecutions to civil rights enforcement. Today, the DOJ oversees several agencies and plays a key role in upholding the rule of law across the country. So, let's jump in and talk about the DOJ with Jeremiah Mosteller, who is the Policy Director for Americans for Prosperity. Jeremiah, I'm very excited for this episode, hoping we can get to our goal.
David, so excited to talk with you again as well. I'm really looking forward to discussing what, to be transparent to your viewers, is my favorite component of the federal government.
Yay. All right. Well, I'm super excited to jump in. And, I just want to tell you, I'm so appreciative. And hopefully our listeners are too, of how much time that you've spent, how much knowledge you've imparted to us, and giving us some great insight in, how we really can make government more efficient for the taxpayers, for their benefit, without really diminishing, the role that they're supposed to play. Anyway.
Yeah. David, well, I'm thankful that you let me do this because I'm a true believer. You know that. We talked about this from day one. We both believe in a smaller federal government, and we've showcased that there's ways to do this without cutting any vital services, taking away anything people need to ensure public safety or public health. And so we just need to take a closer look, and we need these agencies to take a closer look as well.
Exactly. So let's get into Department of Justice. Can you break down the department and their budget a little bit more for us?
Yeah. So, David, the Department of Justice has a budget of $67 billion. It's one of the more complicated when it comes to how it is structured. So I'm going to try and break it down pretty simply for listeners, particularly those that are listening to us versus watching on video. So kind of the first bucket is what is their civil enforcement work, which is where they're actually enforcing the laws by other agencies, whether that's antitrust law, tax law, the Civil Rights Division. So that's kind of one bucket. The second bucket, which is the largest bucket, is their criminal enforcement bucket. And so that does include the 93 U.S. attorneys across the country that enforce federal criminal law. But it also includes a number of other sub-agencies that aren't really enforcement. They're more like punishment agencies, is maybe the easy way for listeners to think about it. So that's the Bureau of Prisons. That's the Drug Enforcement Administration. That's the U.S. Marshals. That's the ATF. So it's more than just that kind of enforcing the law. There is some of that kind of incarceration and punishment components as well there. And then kind of the last bucket, which I'm going to call the other bucket, because there's really no way to classify what these things are. They're kind of just random other things, whether it be grants and programs. So, but it's everything from the pardon attorney, which advises the president on who should be granted a pardon, the Parole Commission, which oversees folks who are under what is now a defunct federal parole system. And then, of course, last but not least, is there's this pretty big bucket of kind of grant making entities that they oversee, the largest being the Office of Justice Programs. So you can see the Department of Justice does such a wide variety of different things, and candidly, a lot of stuff beyond just enforcing the federal law.
Yeah, it's really, unfortunately, we've kind of seen that in a lot of agencies. They've kind of crept into different areas. So something listeners might not know is that there are more than 25 SWAT teams across 18 different federal agencies. Some of the agencies we're talking about are like Amtrak, the National Institutes of Health. I mean, what's the justification for these SWAT teams?
Yeah, David. I mean, like you said, 25 across the federal government. And some of these make a lot of sense. Like the Federal Bureau of Investigations, they should probably have a number of SWAT teams. They're the ones that are coming in, arresting people, enforcing federal law alongside the U.S. attorneys. And so they need these SWAT teams. It's very clear. Listeners can understand that. That's common sense. But when you look at the National Institutes of Health or NASA or the Nuclear Security Administration, it's kind of like, all right, like it starts to feel like a little bit of a stretch for them to have a SWAT team. I mean, I think the easiest way to explain it to listeners is at the end of the day, and we've talked about this, regulations are the product of federal agencies. That's what they create. That's what they enforce. And the reality is when you have a regulation, you need someone to enforce that regulation. And with that comes all of the power of the government. And so they think they need SWAT teams. Even NASA, who has very, very few regulations and really focuses on sending astronauts to the moon, Mars, and the space station. But they still feel like they need to have a SWAT team. And so it's really interesting. And would love to talk more about that. But it comes down at the end of the day, regulations require enforcement.
Yeah, it's kind of like, there's a nail, we need a hammer to hit it. And sometimes that hammer's the SWAT team, I guess. So how often are these really used? And then how much is being spent on them?
Yeah. Well, David, obviously the FBI uses theirs a lot. They use them more than 5,000 times a year. That makes a lot of sense. But some of these other teams, which is very counterproductive, are not deployed at all. And we have no examples in reports and recent publications that they've been deployed. So like the Nuclear Security Administration and the Department of Energy, who both have their own SWAT team, those have not been deployed in all of the information and reports that are out there. And that's concerning because then that means these folks are not actually getting the practice they need. So they're probably subpar in their SWAT enforcement abilities. And so I think my question would be just centralize it in the FBI and have the FBI do all of these activities, just like we have them do a lot of different things. As far as costs, we really don't know. The Government Accountability Office has tried multiple times to get agencies to report on what the cost of these SWAT teams are. To explain to your listeners why it's difficult, it's because most of the employees, particularly in the agencies, for example, that never deploy them, they're doing other jobs. So they're kind of dual vocation individuals who are trained to be on a SWAT team at varying levels of complexity, but also have another day job that they do a lot of times.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just think that this is, maybe it's not a crazy amount of money, although I'm sure they all have top-end equipment and have to get pretty expensive training. But I think it just kind of goes to what we see so often in government where, there's not cooperation across different agencies or departments. Everyone decides that they want their own thing and they build it in their own way. And it's just isn't, one, it's not efficient. And two, it really, reinforces these little kind of this fiefdom mentality where the purpose seems to be to grow your share of the pie rather than, partnering and trying to be more efficient for taxpayers.
Yeah, I mean, David, we talked about this in an earlier episode that folks should go listen to around the Department of Education and the dozens of literacy programs across federal agencies. And I don't think that it's any less serious to have duplication in SWAT teams than it is to have duplication and wasteful billions of dollars of spending when it comes to literacy.
Yeah, exactly right. So DOJ also gives out grants, right? And it's about $5 billion a year. So who are getting these grants, and is there really any accountability on how the money's being spent?
Yeah, I mean, David, at the top level, they give out 11,000 grants, like you said, nearly $5 billion each year, roughly going to nonprofits and local and state governments. When you dig into the data, it's interesting. You see that about 7% of the recipients are unknown. So if you dig into the federal data, we don't actually have the data to know where 7% of these grants are going, or either it's not being reported, one of the two. But when you dig beyond those 7%, you start seeing kind of what you would expect. So you have states like California, Texas, Florida, and New Jersey are some of the biggest recipients. Cities like Chicago and Milwaukee are large recipients. And then you see an interesting mix of nonprofits, everything from ones folks know, like the Boys and Girls Club of America, to more obscure ones like the Institute for Intergovernmental Research, based right outside of DC. It looks like they do a lot of research across different agencies and get paid billions and billions of dollars to do it. So it's going to a variety of different sources, but mainly it's going for functions like reducing crime, improving public safety, greater coordination between state and local agencies. Those types of programs are usually what's being funded.
Yeah, I mean, you see these kind of things at the state level too, and man, there's such variance at times. It's like, a really worthwhile organization getting a bunch of money to keep on their mission and serving the public, and then there's others where it's cronyist, there's friends, there's just do nothing grants that people are just misusing, and it's utterly frustrating when you're the taxpayer. So have there been some issues with these grants, and what are they?
Yeah, David. I mean, there's ongoing issues with these programs because they are administered by a variety of different sub-offices and sub-agencies, as we talked about how big the DOJ is and complicated and complex. So across those 11,000, there's really not a central hub in DOJ that does a good job of making sure that a sub-office or sub-agency isn't duplicating efforts. And I'm not just saying provide $1 million to the same organization to do the same thing, but it's, hey, are they actually targeting the same problem? Are they running grant programs that do the same things? And so that's been a lot of the controversy around the way DOJ carries out its grants, is that it really needs to take an intentional look at how do we make sure there's not duplication happening? How do we make sure we're not double paying for things across different sub-departments and sub-agencies to the same recipient? And so really there's a lot of work that could be done there. And I hope that DOJ will do that. We've seen them take a hard look at the grants already during the Trump administration, cancel a lot of them, some of which I would agree with from a personal capacity and would disagree with from a personal capacity, but they seem to be taking a hard look at them, and that's been much needed and a decades-long thing that should have been done a long, long time ago.
Yeah, agreed. So TJ also has something called asset forfeiture fund. What is that?
David, be careful. You're tempting me with a good time to talk about asset forfeiture here.
I know this actually. I know that this podcast is now going to go for an hour, but
yeah, I will. I promise, though, I will keep it short, David. To kind of explain what this asset forfeiture fund is in like a very short, brief explanation. The federal government, just like state and local governments, engages in what is called asset forfeiture. There's criminal forfeiture, where you seize the property of someone that's been convicted of a crime as part of their punishment, or because that property was the fruits of their crime. And then there's also what is called civil asset forfeiture, which is where local, state, and federal law enforcement seize the money or property of someone that is suspected of a crime and takes that property and keeps it for itself. Now, the latter is controversial because sometimes folks are never convicted or even charged with a crime. And so the federal government is essentially that law enforcement officer, or the agency is acting as judge, jury, and executioner in that case, and saying, well, we're going to keep your $10,000 or your Jeep Wrangler or whatever the property is. And so they have been multiple times slapped down by the Supreme Court about how they've carried out those types of procedures. And there's been a lot of reform in that area, particularly on the state level, where it has been outlawed in a number of states and reformed in a lot of states. But the fund essentially is where all that money and that property flows at the end of the day.
It's incredible to me still. I do know about this, but that you could not be charged with a crime and they'd still keep your money. I mean, to me, that just sounds like stealing, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. So there's this asset forfeiture fund. what could be done with that fund that would help with the budget?
Yeah. So the fund's intent is that the money that flows into the fund is supposed to be used to repay state and local law enforcement for the cost of them engaging alongside the federal government to carry out these forfeiture activities. So that's the purpose of the fund. But multiple times and many times over the year, the Department of Justice consistently goes into that fund and raids it to take money out of the fund to essentially create its own slush fund for discretionary spending that the Department of Justice wants to carry out. Now, some of those things are good things, some of those things are bad things and could be criticized. But at the end of the day, Congress is supposed to have the power of the purse and appropriate the funds. And so our recommendation is that rather than this money being used to create a slush fund, it should actually flow back and be used to reduce the deficit. And so that would save us about $15.5 billion over a 10-year span if we could just take any of the excess money that isn't needed to reimburse state and local law enforcement and put it back into the budget.
Well, so if we took that savings and we add that to our total so far, what would our new total be?
Yeah. Well, David, we are officially over our goal. That would bring us to $2,014.8 billion. And I hope that there's going to be some type of clap or celebration sound in the background as I'm saying this.
Yeah. I should have had a drum roll, man. If I was more highly produced, if I knew how to do that better, I would have done it. That's fabulous.
So we have achieved the goal, man. It's exciting.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for the balloon drop. It's just a little delayed. You ever see it when it doesn't totally fall? No, I think that's big. I mean, Jeremiah, as we've talked about all these, cuts that could be made in these federal agencies, there's so much more out there. I'm just struck by that. Like, you and your team have kind of focused in on some big ticket items, some, really transformative changes, some very commonsensical things. I'm sure there's another layer of enormous cuts that are also out there. And, the fact that, our team has identified over $2 trillion in savings, we have a very talented team, but there's also super talented people with tons more information in the government and elsewhere who really, there's no excuse for them not, other than political will, for them to make these cuts, and the taxpayers deserve it.
Yeah, David, I mean, I couldn't agree anymore. And that's why it's exciting to see Congress considering the rescissions package right now, which would be about $10 billion or $100 billion over 10 years, sitting on the Senate's desk right now for senators to vote on. And so hopefully they'll move that forward, and that they and the administration will continue the work that we've done here and that others have done through the Department of Government Efficiency to keep identifying waste, fraud, and abuse.
Great. Well, Jeremiah, thanks so much for helping us reach our goal of cutting $2 trillion and for being our most consistent and one of our best guests of all time.
Oh, thank you, David. You're going to make me blush over here.
That's fine. Folks, now that we've reached our goal, the focus of this series is going to shift a little from funding cuts to regulation cuts. So be on the lookout for those episodes. If you like this episode and would like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Please remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend freedom and liberty. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.